Welcome everyone to our AIHI webinar. My name is Chrissy Clay and I'm the coordinator of these webinars for the Australian Institute of Health Innovation at Macquarie University. Our topic for today is Bridging the Implementation Gap of Machine Learning in Healthcare, Current Status and Future Directions. Presenting today, we're very lucky, we have the co-chairs of MedInfo 2023, the world's foremost health and medical informatics conference, which will be starting in Sydney in July, so very soon. We have Professor Farah Maghrabi, who is a Professor of Biomedical and Health Informatics at the Australian Institute of Health Innovation at Macquarie University. Farah leads our AI system safety research stream here. We also have Dr. Martin Senaverente, who is a doctor turned data scientist, specialising in machine learning over electronic health records, most recently with Google Health and DeepMind. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Macquarie University is situated, the Wallumagal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, many of you would already be familiar with the Australian Institute of Health Innovation. We are a research-intensive centre creating the evidence to inform improvements to the health system. We are the largest of our kind in Australia and one of the largest of our kind in the world. We are made up of 4 university research centres and 3 national health and medical research centres. We collaborate extensively, both in Australia and around the world, with research and system partners. So perhaps you might hear something today that really sparks an interest and you've thought about doing a PhD. Well, we'd love to hear from you. We're always on the lookout for high caliber candidates. So perhaps have a look at our website and then get in touch if you'd like to find out more. So for today's webinar, Bridging the Implementation Gap of Machine Learning in Healthcare, Current Status and Future Directions, I'll be handing over in just a minute to Professor Farah Maghrabi. As we go along, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A because we're going to allow a nice bunch of time at the end to hear your questions and to have a further discussion between Farah and Martin on this topic. So now I'd like to hand over to Professor Farah Maghrabi.
Thanks very much. Christy, can I just confirm that you can hear me and see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So look, we're going to look at AI today, specifically on the road to implementation and routine clinical use. When we're talking about AI, 2023 seems to be the year of AI, but we can generally think of these as computer systems that perform tasks that typically require human intelligence. We're thinking here of AI systems, not really robots, so to speak, but really computer systems that are being used for pattern recognition, for reasoning, for learning. And we're really interested in the method or the computational method for these AI systems is machine learning, essentially algorithms which make inferences from data. In healthcare, a major area for applying AI is to help clinicians when they're analyzing huge amounts of information, especially when they need to consider this information for diagnosis and treatment. In my presentation, I'm going to cover traditional machine learning models that are specifically designed for a particular task. And then when we move on to Martin's presentation, he's going to talk about the new generation of generative AI systems where, and that's essentially, what's captured the imagination of the public with the release of ChatGPT late last year. So let's get going. In my talk, what I'm going to do is essentially cover clinical grade AI systems. And a couple of years ago, we looked at all of the systems that had been approved by the US Food and Drug Administration. So this to give us a good sample of the kinds of systems that are available now for clinicians to use. Similar to the FDA, the TGA in Australia regulates these AI systems as medical devices. And essentially, there are ML systems that are used for diagnosis and treatment. They're subject to medical device regulations, just like medicines and other therapeutic goods. So what we found from that analysis was essentially 3 levels of automation or 3 types of ways in which AI assists clinicians currently. So the first is where AI provides clinicians with information. The example I have up here is an AI system that is analyzing CT scans to provide clinicians with information about lung volumes, lung lesions that they can then use in their decisions. The second level of automation is where AI systems are assistive. These are actually the vast majority of present-day systems. They're designed to be assistive in the sense that both the clinician and the AI are kind of doing the task side by side, and the clinician needs to check the AI. The example I have here is an AI that is analyzing ECGs to detect abnormal cardiac rhythms. The intended use of this device is essentially that both the AI and the clinician are going to be analyzing the rhythms, and the clinician is going to verify the output provided by the AI. The third group is where AI actually provides decisions. So the example here is a device called IDXDR, which looks at scans of the retina, essentially the back of the eye, to detect a condition called diabetic retinopathy. It gives a decision about the diagnosis of this particular condition. And so systems like this are quite useful, especially if you're trying to provide screening services. So essentially the clinician in this case can act on the information or the decision that is being provided by the AI. So in my presentation, I'm essentially going to deal with these clinical systems that are now available for use in our healthcare settings. And we kind of need to distinguish these from sort of general purpose systems like ChatGPT, for instance, which is kind of a consumer grade system. When we look at these kind of systems, there are actually very few systems in routine clinical use. And one kind of way of looking at why that might be the case is to really think about the journey of an AI system into the real world. So essentially, you can divide that up into 3 kind of parts. The first mile is essentially capturing lots of data, cleaning that data, labeling that data. Second mile is building models based on that data for a specific clinical task. And then the last mile of implementation, when we introduce these systems into real world settings and bring them to clinicians for routine use. And essentially in this webinar, we're dealing with the last mile and kind of talking about why there are fewer systems in routine clinical use today. This has also been talked about in the literature, and a whole bunch of reasons are being discussed, including transparency of algorithms, their suitability for clinical settings, their adaptability, because usually most of these models are developed in isolation of the clinical kind of workflow. There's also a discussion around their equity, safety, and the degree of regulation that happens before a system can be used in clinical settings. Our research is essentially focused here at the AIHI on the safety of these systems. And so we did an analysis, and this has just been published in the Journal of American Medical Informatics Association in the July issue. Essentially, we looked at all of the safety events that have been reported to the FDA. So the FDA is the US regulator for medical devices, and looked at what are the kinds of problems that are involved in these safety events. So essentially, this is the world's first systematic analysis of AI safety in real-world clinical settings. We looked at events over a 6-year period, 266. 16% of these events were associated with patient harm and death. And what we found was that the headline item is essentially that human factors issues were 4 times as likely to result in patient harm compared to technical problems. And so this leaves us with a lot of implications around what it takes to safely design, implement, and use these systems. And as the title of the paper suggests, it's actually more than just the algorithm, because we've put a lot of attention into, curating the data, training the models, but as far as taking these into real-world clinical settings, there's much more than the algorithm in question. So let me just show you some of the kinds of safety problems that we uncovered in this analysis. So this diagram here essentially tries to break up the different parts of the system. So essentially there's a user there, they're using the system, putting in some input. Sometimes, more often than not, there's another device sort of in between the user and the AI system. So here we've got ML medical device, and then the device provides an output to the user. What we found was that around 3% were contraindicated use. We found that there was 4% of the issues related to users providing incorrect outputs, a small proportion there. We found that the vast majority sort of sat here where data was being acquired from other systems. So often other systems feeding data into ML systems, and the vast majority of safety problems stemmed from this part of the system. Algorithm errors were also present. Keeping in mind, look, a lot of attention goes to training these algorithms, and all of the regulation that we have is focused on the device itself. And still we had a small proportion, again, around 11%, where the problems related back to the algorithm, and then also the device output, which is sort of a negligible proportion there. Let me show you some of the examples of patient harm. This is an a diagnostic ultrasound due to the incorrect input of correct settings. Signals indicating mitral valve insufficiency were not observed on a cardiac ultrasound Doppler, delaying diagnosis. The patient later died. In mammography, incorrectly entered data resulted in a patient requiring biopsy markers to be surgically removed after they were placed in an incorrect location. In radiotherapy planning, due to the input errors by users, some patients were overdosed and some had radiation delivered to the wrong location. Insulin dosing, another problem here where a patient suffered hypoglycemia when given insulin without the carbohydrates recommended by the insulin dosing software. And last but not least, we had a whole lot of safety incidents involving consumer ECG systems. So these were over-the-counter ECG devices that indicated a normal sinus rhythm while the patients were in fact experiencing a heart attack, a condition the device was neither indicated nor capable of detecting. And so some consumers actually delayed seeking medical care based on the results that the device provided. So essentially the device in this case was to detect arrhythmias, not necessarily heart attacks. And so because the device was indicating a normal sinus rhythm, the patients kind of had a misunderstanding that they were okay, even though they were experiencing a heart attack. And just to balance things out, we also had some algorithm errors. And one example here that I thought was worth discussing was this device called a fractional flow reserve. So essentially, the device kind of looks for blockages in certain arteries and gives clinicians information about the location as well as the degree of blockage in the artery from CT scans. So in the event description, the user of the device reported a false negative result, and the patient had an acute event along with diagonal kind of infarcts. So essentially, the device was silent, although there was something wrong here with the patient. And so the manufacturer gets to respond to the incident, and their narrative essentially was talking about instructions were not clearly followed, and they were kind of referring doctors back that the FFR-CT values should be reviewed as one of several clinical data points, and they need to be used in conjunction with the patient's original CT images, clinical history, symptoms, and other diagnostics tests, as well as an appropriately trained clinical clinician's critical judgment to evaluate the patient. So essentially referring back to say, look, the device is only providing you one piece of information. You need to be putting together the whole story and kind of making a decision. So directing clinicians back to the intended use of the device. As part of this analysis, what we did was we kind of collated all of the safety events where patients were harmed and those that were not. And this is kind of a graph that sort of shows the difference there. So essentially what we found were that use problems are proportionally higher in the events where patients were harmed. So let me show you this a little bit. So essentially the bar on the left-hand side is the events where patients were not harmed. The orange bit is essentially they were mostly device problems. There was a small proportion of use problems, so 4%. But when we looked at the devices where patients were harmed, there was many more problems with the actual kind of use of the device. And I've sort of shown you a few examples of those. So what are some of the considerations for the use of AI in real-world settings? And so here, what I want to do is to draw on an example system that we are working with at the moment. So this is a digital health CRC funded project. We're working with a company called Analyse.ai. And the picture here is of their AI system. So it's a class 1 medical device that is registered with the Therapeutic Goods Administration. It's a system that looks at X-rays, so essentially analyzes X-rays of the lung and detects chest X-rays, essentially, not lungs, and essentially gives out, marks up 124 radiological findings. So the image on the left-hand side is the original X-ray, and the image on the right-hand side is the AI findings. The nice thing about this AI is that it not only gives you the findings, but it locates the findings and also gives you a degree of confidence in those findings. So when this company came to us, it's a system that is designed by radiologists for radiologists. But there is a potential use of this in an ED setting, often because chest X-rays are usually prescribed for about half of the patients that come through an ED, and ED doctors need to make a decision based on these X-rays in advance of the formal report coming along from radiology. And so there is a potential use case in ED where having rapid, access to a facility to analyze chest X-rays would allow clinicians to kind of make decisions quickly and hopefully improve flow in emergency departments. And this is an important problem that is being tackled pretty much across all of the world. So there is a use case around improving patient flow in ED. Another potential area for such a system is for trainee doctors. Essentially, another second pair of eyes to help them as they learn to read X-rays. And also the follow-up of incidental findings. So usually in ED, doctors are, concerned about the types of things or the types of problems that they need to address urgently, and sometimes they might miss incidental findings, and usually it's left to the end of the week where somebody goes through all of the X-rays to look at which findings need to be followed up and sort of sent on to general practice for follow-up. So the question we're sort of asking here is, how do you integrate a system like this safely into emergency department workflow, keeping in mind that we have the chest X-ray AI, there is a certain clinical context. And so how are we going to integrate it into that context to help doctors make better decisions around diagnosis and management? And then ultimately, how would that improve the disposition or, and what that essentially means is kind of what happens to the patient. Do they get sent on, do they get sent home faster and with the right treatment happening? Some of the considerations we kind of need to think about is that X-rays are sometimes taken on mobile kind of machines like this. Some other X-rays where the patient is well enough might be, taken while at an X-ray kind of in radiology where the patient is kind of walked over and taken. So when we have a system like this, how are you going to integrate it into different devices that are used in ED? And also then how are you going to provide that information back to clinicians? So if the X-ray was taken on a mobile device, the clinician would pretty much stare at it on the machine and make a decision and move along. Whereas if it was taken at an X-ray kind of machine, like shown in the figure here, they would actually wait for that X-ray to come back as part of the electronic medical record. So how would you provide the results back to the doctors at the point of care in the manner in which they expect? The other question is, how do you integrate this into radiology workflow? Because even if you had the AI that was providing clinicians with some information at that point in care, the X-ray would still be reviewed by radiologists, and they would want to know what the AI told the doctor. And then would there be any findings that they would still need to be kind of followed up on? So there's a question about a wider radiology workflow and how we would integrate it into that workflow as well. And last but not least, not to forget the existing IT systems. So this is technically, this sits kind of on its own, and how you're going to make sure it integrates and you get information going backwards and forwards from the electronic medical record to the system and then feed the information back into the record. So that's the broader kind of IT infrastructure, and every hospital has a slightly different infrastructure that needs to be looked at. So in summary, we've sort of seen that, issues with these kind of systems, especially in their safety, are more than algorithms. Yes, the algorithm is responsible for some issues or safety problems, but a lot of the safety issues that we saw in the events we looked at came from use problems, whether it was contraindicated use or errors in task execution. And the biggest group of safety events came from these issues with data acquisition, which was often another system that was feeding data into the AI. So that's kind of the story. It's much more than the algorithms. We need to take a whole of systems approach. We need to carefully now look at the last mile of implementation as well as use, and focusing on specifically the clinical workflow, the human factors issues, as well as the systems use practices, and how these systems might change clinical workflow, and also the interface with existing IT systems, so we minimize those errors that were coming from data acquisition. So let me kind of quickly close by, so we're actually recruiting doctors. We have an online study that is currently underway. We're recruiting ED doctors. And so if you're an ED doctor out there, you're interested in testing an AI, please go to that link that you see on the screen, or get in touch with us. All Australian ED doctors are eligible as long as you've worked in ED in the last 12 months. What you will get asked to do would be to review 18 ED scenarios, and you'll get AI findings for about half of them. So essentially, it'll give you, what we're trying to do here is to measure the impact of this kind of AI system on diagnosis and management in a controlled setting. The next kind of plug I have is MedInfo, which nicely takes me on to introducing Martin as well. So Martin and I, as Chrissy mentioned to you earlier on, are co-chairs for the World Congress for Medical Informatics, which gets underway in just under 2 weeks. It's in Sydney. If you're a student out there, you're wondering about this area, well, what better time to come along and learn, because you'll see people from right across the globe, and the program is enormous. Whatever area you're interested in, you'll sort of find something to interest you. So with that, let me stop and hand over to Martin to do his presentation.
But thank you very much for having me. This I think complements really nicely a lot of things that Farah has mentioned earlier on in this idea of kind of an implementation gap between sort of the models that are being developed and what we are seeing infiltrate into the bedside or into patients' hands. And specifically, as Farah mentioned, I wanted to sort of reinterpret this idea of bridging the implementation gap in this new large language model era. So first off, a little bit about me. I've had a winding journey through the world of digital health. I began from a clinical background back in Sydney. I grew up down the road from Macquarie Uni in Lane Cove. And my path since or during clinical medicine has taken me sort of via the George Institute, via a startup based in Sydney called CancerAid, eventually to Stanford, where I spent a couple of years in the informatics department, and then more recently to DeepMind and Google, where I was working on essentially 2 electronic health record related projects over 4+ years that I was there. One was an applied research effort around applications of machine learning to EHR data, predominantly for clinical decision support. And the second was essentially FHIR-based infrastructure for lightweight, mobile-based EHRs called Open Health Stack. Now, it's been really nice to see already on the participant list a number of people from various points of this journey. So thank you very much for coming along. The news on my end is that recently I've left Google and I'm working on something new. So watch this space. And with that, I'll say, disclaimer, these are my personal kind of editorial views of the landscape. These are not official Google views, but I'll be speaking about some of the work we've published over the last 12 months in particular, and then some of the mega trends in this field. So in terms of the framing of this talk, I, along with some Stanford colleagues, published this paper, Bridging the Implementation Gap of Machine Learning in Healthcare back in 2019, that was sort of talking about this idea of a model graveyard, that so many models get published on, but then they gather dust in the model graveyard and never get out the door. I've been speaking on that topic for the last couple of years, and really today sort of significantly reworked that sort of presentation in light of the explosion in sort of generative AI that we have seen in healthcare. And I think a lot of the same principles apply, but just need to be sort of tweaked and reconsidered given sort of the step change that we're seeing in the industry. So I'll go through that story in kind of 5 chapters, if you like. And the first chapter is tool or threat. We have a video to get started.
There's been a great deal of worry expressed by both physicians and laypeople that the doctor is getting further and further away from the actual practice of medicine and turning into a cold, impersonal medical technologist. For a definitive opinion by a medical educator, we spoke with Professor Robert Schilling, chairman of the Department of Medicine of the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Schilling, won't Link and other computer devices like it help increase the distance between the doctor and the patient?
No, computers need not increase the distance. They are time-saving devices, and they might improve the communication between the doctor and his patient by allowing the doctor to use his time discussing the pertinent aspects of the history revealed by the computer. So I look for the computer as a way of stretching the available medical talent.
And you don't feel that it will in any way injure the doctor-patient relationship?
No, if used properly, the time can be used to improve the doctor-patient relationship.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schilling.
Thank you, Mr. Prout.
So for a long time, there has been this existential tension in the digital health informatics space between, are these technologies a tool or are they a threat to, this sacrosanct doctor-patient relationship, a threat to sort of physicians' time, to the sort of privacy of the data, et cetera. And that has continued to play out, over the decades that have followed. This is a favorite picture from a JAMA article back in 2012, where you see on the left, this is a child's drawing, and you see on the left, the doctor during a consultation as the child has seen it. And the doctor is facing away from the child and their family, typing away at the computer, right? So this article is all about sort of the cost of technology in healthcare. Is this sort of destroying something special? And I think that tension has continued to play out into the, if you like, machine learning era over the last, say, 5 years in healthcare. Eric Topol has spoken a lot about this topic around how, if harnessed correctly, machine learning can actually help to sort of bring back some of the humanity into healthcare because it gives doctors and patients more time. But equally, there are, legitimate and very valid fears around, does the value really match the hype? And when will we see some sort of hard patient outcomes from all of the sort of excitement around AI? The National Academy of Medicine in the US said this in their report in 2021: "We believe it is imperative to proceed with caution, else we may end up with user disillusionment and another AI winter, and or further exacerbate existing health and technology-driven disparities." And so that tension has really led us to this implementation gap. The idea that, on the left, there is a lot of promising innovation, but actually very few things make it through into kind of having clinical impact. This was an article published by Karolinska Institute late last year about some of this gap playing out in the literature. And essentially, they did a lit review. They found over 5,000 papers identified between 2012 and 2022 about AI in healthcare. And according to their eligibility criteria, only 50 of those were formal implementation studies. And those numbers may vary a little bit, but order of magnitude, we're seeing, under 5% of the papers that get put out, well under, are actually deployed in any way into the clinic. And the same applies in the startup world. And we hear so much about all of the VC funding going into the digital health space, this proliferation of startups. And many are getting through and being used. Farah mentioned the Annalise program. There are many others that are starting to bridge this gap. But it is still a small minority. On the right, you see data updated as of February this year, that around 500 algorithms have been cleared by the FDA for use. But the vast majority of these are in radiology, 400 in radiology, 60 in cardiology, and then a few scattered other algorithms. So when we're thinking about sort of even in the EHR space, it is still a vanishingly small number of things that are getting into use. Which leads us to chapter 3, which is sort of this, not Cambrian, but LLM explosion that we've seen over the last 6 months in particular. I like this GIF a lot. It is kind of an evolutionary tree of the sort of developments in large language models since 2018. And you see, there are many things even missing from this tree, but you just see the explosion that we've sort of observed over the last 12, 24 months in terms of the number of very large tech companies putting out very large models, but then also the activity in the open source community that's not far behind, that is just sort of flourishing in this space. Right? And we've seen that same flourishing when it comes to healthcare applications. And I think there are kind of two reasons for this explosion. One is what I'll call the dinner table effect. This idea that, your kids and your grandparents have heard and are using ChatGPT, and that applies for hospital executives as well. And, it has infiltrated into the public consciousness in a way that machine learning in healthcare just has never done in the past. And the second, perhaps more seriously, is this genuine technical advance that we have seen in this space. And there are two particular kind of sub-themes here that are worth calling out. One is the multimodality or the generality that these LLMs provide, the ability to reason over multiple different data types and express their outputs in multiple different modalities. And, you know, you will have seen the sort of text-to-text models, the text-to-image models, text-to-video models, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this sort of cross-modality work has opened up a lot of possibilities that were never available before. And the second, which I think has captured a bit of the public imagination as well, but is legitimately exciting, is this sort of concept of emergence. So on the right is a paper that came out from Google and DeepMind late last year, emergent abilities of large language models. And they looked at some toy examples in some ways, or benchmark examples of LLM or natural language understanding tasks, grounded mappings, word unscrambling, identifying words in context, benchmark tasks. And what they saw was that there are these interesting upticks in the performance on this task above a certain parameter size of these models, right? You know, you pass 10 to the 22 parameters and all of a sudden there are these interesting upticks. And the same kind of step change has been seen in a number of other sort of use cases and domains, and is continuing to be seen. Right? One of my favorite examples, and this is kind of a classic problem, is this Sally Ann problem, which is a theory of mind test that is sometimes used in the evaluation of children with autism. The idea is, you know, the prompt is supposed to get at whether the reader can really kind of step into the mind of the characters in the prompt. Right? So I won't go through in detail for time's sake, but suffice to say, you know, there was this really incredible paper, Sparks of AGI, that was put out by Microsoft just in March of this year, that looked at this and a number of other examples around how these LLMs are really starting to, you know, level up in terms of performance in what had previously been impossible tasks. Right? Now, with that as a backdrop, this technical advance and the public awareness of these models, we are seeing health really become a key arena where exciting things are happening. Google has been very actively involved. On the left is a paper that a team, you know, I was involved in as well, that was looking at sort of whether large language models encoded clinical knowledge based on sort of a formal, rigorous evaluation of the outputs of what was then the first MedPalm model, and specifically looking at this sort of benchmark use case of answering questions from the US medical licensing exam. Right? And yeah, there were some very, very interesting findings from that paper that have then led to the development of MedPalm 2 and so forth, medically specific large language models that are able to reason over sometimes very nuanced medical question. And at the same time, Microsoft has been doing some amazing work in this space. Harshanori and others published a similar paper around the US medical licensing exam using GPT 3.5 and 4. And you know, on the subject of emergence, are seeing this step change rise even between GPT 3.5 and 4 with on few-shot learning tasks on medical registration exam questions. But you know, in both papers, and this is a line from the Microsoft one, you know, recognize there is a large gap between competency or proficiency on examinations and other medical benchmarks and the successful fielding and use of GPT-4 in clinical application. Right? As, you know, we haven't crossed the implementation gap. But there are some exciting applications starting to emerge. These again are two from the Googleverse. On the left is a paper looking at, that was back in January, looking at the expansion of medical abbreviations using a large language model. Some of the bottom example here is an interesting one where PT can mean so many different things in a medical note. Is it patient? Is it physical therapy? Is it prothrombin time? And being able to expand those abbreviations based on the context of the note is something that LLMs are surprisingly good at. On the right, you see some of the patient understandable answers that MedPalm is starting to generate. There have been use cases with doctor notes. This is a company, Glass AI, that is using an LLM, just plugging into GPT, as far as I can see, to reason over kind of a medical prompt and help with clinical documentation. And there are a whole suite of other applications. The list goes on and on. This is a tweet from Vishnu, who I think is on the call, has been doing some amazing work with Cardinal Kit and plugging in LLMs to mobile applications that allow patients to kind of reason and question answer basically over their health records. And similarly on the right from Science.io, can you have a question answering dialogue-based system that helps doctors or patients understand what is otherwise a really messy, cumbersome medical record? And so with all of that, we are going from already an implementation gap to something like this, where we are getting just this explosion of use cases, and it's going to grow and grow. And so where does this leave us? And I want to wrap up in the next 5 minutes and leave time for questions. So I will be brief. But kind of reinterpreting our framework from that 2019 paper for this LLM era, we kind of land on these 4 quadrants, which overlap a lot with, and really nicely with what Farah was talking about earlier. And how can we bridge this implementation gap? We need good data systems. We need user-centered design. We need methods to ground LLMs in medical fact. And we need infrastructure for clinical safety and regulation. So I'll go through each of those in brief. On the data front, we need large, high quality, multimodal, representative, open, data sets to help encode clinical knowledge in these systems. We can go into more detail on all of those different bits. But suffice to say, the sort of engine that fuels all of these is good quality data, including, systems where we can infuse, well, I'll come to knowledge infusion, but we need good data, because even for LLMs, there is sort of a garbage in, garbage out phenomenon. And, currently the system's trained on sort of unselected text from web scrapings are not necessarily going to be the best suited to medical tasks. And so how do we think about a scale of data for multimodal and scale of multimodal data that suits the capacity of these models? I'll leave it at that. Secondly, user-centered design. So we need to choose use cases wisely such that there is a clear clinician, patient, health system benefit. Right? Not LLM related, but we published a piece a year or two ago around user-centered design for machine learning in healthcare with our Stanford collaboration around sort of developing tools for care managers. Right? And I actually think a lot of the same principles apply here. One lens that I'm finding useful is almost thinking about this in terms of sort of product market fit in kind of the lean startup world. And in this case, we almost need sort of model user fit or use case model fit, where we need to kind of blend the capabilities of these models with the likely sort of actionability story behind them. And as a general theme, I think that a lot of the sort of data munging back office functions, things like data cleaning, summarization, training, even sort of medical translation, health literacy, things like that, are going to be the gateway use cases before kind of traditional clinical decision support or clinician augmentation for deploying some of these tools, right? It's a lower liability profile. We can start to sandbox some of these tools and develop sort of trust and systems and guardrails for these. Thirdly, grounding.
Just
How
a
can we-
reminder on time. Just a quick
Perfect.
reminder on time.
Yeah, so I'll wrap up over the next 3 minutes or so, 2-3. So how can we infuse LLMs with medical knowledge? This was a paper that we published with Google Health Bangalore or Google Research Bangalore around knowledge infusion for activity coaching in LLMs. There are many, many methods emerging. I would say this is one of the hottest research areas in terms of LLM architecture, how to blend established fact and knowledge with LLMs, which can otherwise obviously, be really black box systems. One thing that is working in our favor is the expanding context windows of these models, which mean that even in a single prompt, you are able to include much, much more sort of grounding information, 32,000 tokens at the moment with GPT-4 versus just 2,000, a few months ago with GPT-3. That's going to increase and increase. I'm going to skip over this. And then finally, sort of getting the ethics, clinical safety, and regulation right. This is something that Farah talked about very eloquently earlier on. And a lot of the same issues apply with LLMs as they did in the sort of the deep learning, traditional machine learning era. It's a very nice piece from Judy Gachoya and others about the ethics of LLMs specifically, which talked about hidden biases in the data, the sense of potential breach of trust if the use of LLMs is not disclosed, of which there have been several examples so far, authorship and attribution, cost barriers to access, sending sensitive data to LLM APIs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the regulators are starting to get on board. The FDA actually has open for comment at the moment. I think it closes in early July for how they should think about dealing with LLMs. And so to end with sort of the takeaways, bridging the implementation gap is becoming more urgent in this era of LLMs. We need large, high quality data sets to fuel these systems. We need user-centered design to make sure that the use case matches and that these are embedded in workflows appropriately. We need methods and architectures to make sure that medical fact is used to ground or constrain or guardrail these models. And then we need clinical safety and regulation, sort of operational processes to, again, sort of guardrail and make sure they're sort of fit for purpose. And so I'll end there. Again, along with Farah, plug for MedInfo, which is happening in a couple of weeks. There's my email down the bottom right if anyone wants to get in touch afterwards, and very happy to take questions.